they only become painful. How could something which at the start was not a beginning of pain in the end increase and become intense pain? That which from the start was a small incipient cause of pain is mistaken for pleasure. It is like a fool who thinks the last half ladle of his parents' fried bread will satisfy his hunger. Assertion: pleasure caused by the alleviation of pain exists. Answer: when a rich man, vomiting into a gold pot, sees his servant vomit into a clay one, though vomiting is equally unpleasant for both, he thinks how prosperous he is. Like the rich man who feels delighted, one mistakes for real pleasure the feeling of satisfaction when pain has been alleviated and becomes less acute, but there is no real pleasure. For instance, the feeling of satisfaction, as the pain of being burnt somewhat decreases when one moves out of the scorching sun into the shade, is called the pleasure of alleviated pain, but the suffering of cold begins as soon as the discomfort of heat diminishes. Thus there is no pleasurable sensation entirely free from discomfort. Since ordinary people's pain does not require even a weak pleasurable feeling as a basis in relation to which it is established, it is said that ordinary people have real suffering but no real pleasure. However, it is incorrect to assert that nominally pleasure does not exist, for that would be to deny fact. The difference should be understood as illustrated by the following analogy. Even when blue and yellow are juxtaposed, the perception of blue as blue and not as yellow arises, whereas when a long thing is placed beside a much longer one, the perception of it as short arises. The use of real in this context should not be confused with real as the object of refutation by reasoning. It is like a man who eagerly swallows horse dung, regarding it as pleasant, because he thinks it will calm the suffering caused by his illness.
Assertion: pleasure does exist because when, for instance, one moves a load from one shoulder to the other, a sense of pleasure arises. If there were no pleasure, one would not move it. Answer: when the discomfort of carrying a load on the right shoulder for a long time becomes intense and one moves it on to the left one, it is merely that a slight pain which is beginning stops the intense pain already produced, not that there is no discomfort at all. How can there be pleasure while a new and different pain is beginning or while intense pain is stopping? Although when one takes birth some forms of suffering stop, it is inappropriate to regard that as pleasure. The author Aryadeva says it seems this is why in the Sutra of Advice to Katyayana, the subduer said, when Katyayana's son is born, only suffering is born. Also when he ceases, only suffering ceases. One should understand this as explained extensively in the Nanda Entering the Womb Sutra, and through the analogy of carrying a load.
Assertion: real suffering exists but is not apparent because pleasure conceals it. Answer: if real suffering exists but common beings do not notice it because pleasurable feelings disguise it, there should be pleasure which is stronger than suffering. Why is there no pleasure that can obscure suffering? Because ordinary people do not have real pleasure. It is like the following analogy: a man pursued by an elephant falls into an old well. He stops his fall halfway down by catching hold of some couch grass at whose root a rat is gnawing. Below, a large snake lies in wait, and from the sides pythons writhe toward him. Meanwhile he is absorbed in tasting the honey which drips from above and thinks of that as pleasure. When childish beings in cyclic existence, pursued by the elephant of death, fall into the well of old age, they stop their fall halfway by catching hold of the couch grass root of virtuous paths of action. Below, the snake of bad rebirths lies in wait, and pythons of disturbing emotions writhe toward them from all sides. While the rat of maturation is gnawing at the couch grass root of life, they are absorbed in tasting the honeyed drops of craving for attractive objects. But as in the analogy, there is only suffering and not even the slightest real pleasure. The other analogy should be understood from Candrakirti's commentary. A crow perched inside the carcass of an elephant and was drowned when a sudden rainstorm flooded it, paying a heavy price for small gain. Children absorbed in the enjoyment of attractive objects overlook the dangers involved and are drowned in the ocean of cyclic existence.
Assertion: if the body's nature were suffering, it would be unnecessary for the teacher, Buddha, to say that the body is suffering, just as there is no need to point out that the sun is hot. Answer: there is no such fault, for though the body's nature is suffering, because of confusion one does not realize it and, thinking it pleasurable, one circles in cyclic existence. Our teacher therefore said, mistaking suffering for pleasure, you are not free from attachment. Common beings need to be told this. Certainly that is why the Tathagatas have said, Sister, the foremost of all obstructions is ignorance. In other words, they have said that confusing real suffering with pleasure is the worst confusion of all. It is like the following analogy: taking her wages, a servant girl did only half the work and then left it. Her mother told her that whatever she took hold of, she should hold on tight. One day she took hold of a donkey's tail, and though others told her not to hold on, she did not let go but repeated, whatever you take hold of, hold on tight. Similarly, the teacher instructed those in the grip of confusion's errors, who cling to the idea of suffering as pleasure, to develop aversion to suffering.
Assertion: though the body is impermanent, it is pleasurable. Answer: that is not so. Whatever is impermanent, like the body, which is a maturation of contaminated past actions and disturbing emotions, is definitely damaged by factors causing disintegration, and therefore produces aversion. Anything affected by causes of harm, whose character is to produce aversion, is not pleasurable. Therefore all that is impermanent and contaminated is said to be suffering, just as anything that falls into a salt pit becomes salty. Having aroused in trainees aversion to cyclic existence, the author Aryadeva quotes Sutras saying that birth is suffering, to bring them to enlightenment. Also in the treatises of knowledge, the teacher says that the 5 contaminated aggregates are suffering.
They are suffering, its sources, the world, the basis of views and also existence. And, whatever without exception has any of the 3 kinds of suffering is thus suffering. And, the attractive, the unattractive, and all else that is contaminated. The author Aryadeva explains the faults of cyclic existence, establishing the intended meaning of these statements to bring those who are afraid and desire liberation into the great vehicle. Moreover, the teacher said, Monks, while you have been circling in cyclic existence, there is no one who has not been in the position of your father, mother, and so forth. Realizing this, just as bodhisattvas willingly make sacrifices to rescue sentient beings from cyclic existence in the ship of the great vehicle, the author of the treatise shows extensively in the first 4 chapters how to generate the aspiring altruistic attitude intent on highest enlightenment by explaining the faults of cyclic existence. Although the lines quoted here are from the Master Vajjabandhu's treasury of knowledge, they are clearly words from the Sutras on knowledge. With reference to this, some learned teachers say that although the Master Vajjabandhu holds that the 7 treatises of knowledge are not sutra, the spiritual father and